Warning, this fic contains many dark and adult themes. For the full list provided by the author, please check the description below and proceed with caution. Welcome back, this is Falling for You by 1967 Hogwarts Goddess, a Percy Jackson fanfic. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoy and subscribe for future stories. Please check the description for a full list of tags and the link to drop a kudos for the original author. With that out of the way, let's get started. Summary. In an alternate series of events, Percy saves Annabeth from falling into Tartarus. Too bad he can't save himself. As Annabeth leads the Seven on a treacherous quest to meet him at the doors of death, Percy fights through a wasteland of pain, torture, and difficult choices. Surrounded by monsters, alone in the darkest corner of the underworld, he starts to question whether he's a good kid anymore. Chapter 1. Annabeth I. For Annabeth, nothing was more satisfying than watching a giant spider fall down a pit. Whole chunks of the floor had just caved in around them. The assembled group watched, grimly interested, as the hulk of Arachne flew down into the black and empty space of Tartarus below. Hazel was dabbing at a wound on her arm, Frank watching closely with worry, but out of all of them it was Annabeth especially who breathed a sigh of relief. No more spiders. Thank the gods. And they had the Athena Parthenos finally in their grasp. They could unite the camps, stop at least one of the brewing wars that threatened them. Annabeth was actually surprised that things had gone so smoothly, excluding her broken ankle, but she just dismissed that. She had taken some ambrosia, warming her up from the inside with the taste of the Jacksons' blue chocolate chip pancakes, but it still twinged despite her makeshift cast. Turned out bubble wrap didn't work as well as she had hoped for supporting broken bones. The area around them was a wreck. Cracks crept up the gray walls, parts of the ceiling completely missing, revealing the Argoi hovering above against the blue sky. The brightly colored tapestries around them were torn and some were quietly burning. Annabeth's gaze wandered amongst them, frowning as she saw Percy in quite a few of them, a tsunami at his back in one, a strange sword in his hand in another, burning green eyes trained on her from every viewpoint. It was slightly unsettling. The remaining floor had spiderweb cracks covering every inch, and Jason seemed to be hovering slightly, the tips of his trainers barely grazing, uneasy of the fragile surface. Percy stood next to her, his calloused hand holding her own. He was also watching the giant spider plummet, glancing back at her occasionally. Each time he did, she fell a little further for him. She watched the way his cheek creased when he smiled out the corner of his eye at her, which made his irises swirl with humor, and Annabeth couldn't help but reciprocate, squeezing his hand. She'd gone too long without him. She surveyed the rest of the group as they began to walk to the ship. They seemed fine, just a little tired, only a few of them in their armor. They'd been in a rush. Piper had her cornucopia swung victoriously over one shoulder and Jason's hand tightly in her own. Frank and Hazel were walking closely together too. A spike of pain shot up her ankle and she shook her head to try and clear her mind. She probably needed medical attention to actually set the bone right, and she filed it away in her mind under things to do later. She glanced up into the sky, or more importantly, the huge floating blob in the middle of it. The giant doors of the ship closed around the imposing statue. The Athena Parthenos was loaded up and ready to go on the Argo II, courtesy of Nico and Leo. As much as she wanted to keep watching Arachne fall, Annabeth knew she had to tear her eyes away and turn to walk back to the ship. Around her, coils of spider silk span round and round madly in their piles, disappearing down into the pit as if being sucked into a massive hoover. A sharp pain shot up her bad leg again and she gasped, stumbling slightly. What is it? Percy glanced around from where he was walking slightly in front of her, his expression concerned. Nothing, Annabeth said, but it came out as more of a question. She tried to stagger toward the ladder but felt a resistance. Why? There was a jolt and suddenly she was staggering backwards at an alarming rate. Her pace got quicker, almost running. Unable to stay upright any longer, Annabeth's head blared with alarm as her legs yanked out from under her. She yelped as she fell on her front, pausing briefly. Her ankle, Hazel shouted from the ladder. Cut it, cut it. Annabeth's mind was woolly from the pain. Cut her ankle. Apparently, Percy didn't realize what Hazel meant either, judging by his twin look of both panic and confusion. There was another strong tug backwards. Then something began to drag her toward the pit. Annabeth scrabbled on the floor for a hand hold, digging in her nails like claws, sliding rapidly backwards, panting in pain and panic. She left scratches in the floorboards, friction burning her fingertips. It was like it was in slow motion. Everyone had turned to watch in terror, frozen at the sight. Everyone except Percy. An inch before she would have been dragged off of the edge, Percy had desperately snapped into action and sprinted towards her, diving forwards at the last second. She saw a flash of bronze, riptide automatically in his hand, and he slashed through the thick webbing. The pulling ceased and Annabeth clung to the floor, her heart pounding wildly. Next to her she watched in horror as Percy fell on the ground with a hard thump, riptide flying out his hand across the ground, and her eyes widened as she saw the arm Percy that had flung out to catch himself seemed to bend in what was decidedly the wrong angle. A crude snap filled her blood with ice. But his momentum was too difficult to stop. As Annabeth hung on to the frightening edge, legs close to dangling in the black abyss, Percy tumbled over it. Annabeth heard distant screaming before realizing a second later it was her own. "Percy!" she screamed almost involuntarily. She scrambled wildly to turn around, her head dangling over to see. Everyone had already begun to run forwards to try and help both of them, and they caught up seconds later, hands on Annabeth's shoulders just in time to stop her leaning body from falling in two. Their hearts stopped at the horrifying sight below them. Percy was far down into the pit, too far away, clinging by his raw fingertips to a small ledge. Annabeth choked a sob as she saw the unnatural way the skin on his arm poked out, clearly broken and causing the heavy pained pants she could hear rising up. She stretched her arms fruitlessly towards him and darted her head about, searching desperately for some way to get to him. Even from her relatively secure position above, she could feel the unnatural gravity from Tartarus, dust from the stones around them being sucked over the precipice like a black hole. How Percy could hold on, she had no idea. He was clearly having trouble. His broken arm was locked painfully, his face shadowed, shaking and gasping as he supported his full weight. His legs scrabbled madly against the walls trying to gain leverage, but the once rugged stone was now smooth. Like black glass. Tartarus wanted Percy. "Percy!" Annabeth shouted down to him. "Annabeth!" Percy grunted loudly, face purple with pain and exertion. Annabeth racked her brain. Come on, she was supposed to be smart, wisdom and logic, a daughter of Athena, damn it. A rumble echoed up from the void, making them all flinch. A snarl and a dark laugh mixed together. Percy shuddered with fatigue, and Annabeth's heart broke. "Percy, just hold on, just please hold on." She was begging, hot tears sliding down her cheeks and dripping off her nose into the darkness. Was there any more silk they could use as a ladder? She looked about madly, cursing again and again. It had all fallen down the hole. Next to her, Nico also leaned over the edge of the chasm, thrusting out his hand, but he was much too far away to help. Her breathing was fast and erratic. Percy tilted his head upwards with what seemed like a lot of effort, and she realized that it was all he could do not to black out. His face was gaunt, scraped and bloody, his hair dusted with cobwebs, but when he locked eyes with her she thought he had never looked more handsome. "Annabeth!" he yelled and painfully redid his shaky hold. "Nico." His voice came out louder and stronger and she gulped down her sobs to listen. Nico leant his head over. His face was filled with a childlike fear Annabeth had never seen before. "The doors of death!" Percy shouted to them. Nico's eyes widened, and Annabeth began to shake her head from side to side in denial. Nico started. "I'll meet you there, I'll cut the chains," Percy continued, his voice getting weaker, trailing off. She saw his broken arm start to tremble and he withdrew it towards himself, tucking it to his torso with a soft groan as if he was trying to keep it attached to him. But now he was only supported by one stretched and desperately shaking arm, knuckles stark white and sticking out. He didn't have long. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Get them to the doors, Nico, promise me." "Perry. You have to promise me," Percy yelled determinedly, his voice cracking. Nico nodded, tears of his own also falling, his hand still outstretched as if he had forgotten it was there, hanging in the dead air. "I promise," he whispered, not that much louder than the hissing from the pit. Percy nodded jerkily, his face tight. Annabeth still had a cold hand extended towards him. "Percy," she stuttered, not fully coherent. "I love you, Annabeth, I'll come back, I'll find you again no matter what, I promise." Percy gasped the last part out, legs still weakly kicking. Annabeth's breath hitched. "I love you too, seaweed brain," she sobbed, an oath to keep with a final breath. This had to be part of the prophecy. Percy tried to smile reassuringly, even as he relaxed his wrenched fingers and they slipped off the ledge. She heard Nico and Hazel still screaming for help. She saw his glinting eyes far, far below, helplessly aware that this could be the last time she would ever see them. He made no sound as he fell. Tartarus, not even the gods, went down there, and Percy was alone. She couldn't help it. She broke down into heart-wrenching sobs as he disappeared into the black, hunching herself over as a howl of rage tore out of her. Part of the floor broke away on the other side of the void, the room starting to shake. A trembling hand entered her blurry vision and patted her heaving shoulders. She saw blonde hair through her tears. It was Jason. Annabeth, he started, still staring blankly at the abyss. He appeared to be struggling for words, and Annabeth felt like scoffing. Of course he was. What do you say to someone who just saw someone they love fall into literal hell? Annabeth wouldn't know what to say either. She didn't even know what to say now. She started crying with more vigor, unable and unwilling to hold it in anymore. She heard Jason try again, his voice wobbling. Annabeth, it isn't safe. The floor, we need to go. Annabeth could hear the sense, could hear the logic, but shook her head. She couldn't leave Percy. He could still come back. She couldn't leave him. Oh gods, breathed another voice, Piper. Annabeth looked up shakily through spiky eyelashes. She followed a pointed finger towards the floor and inhaled sharply. Riptide. Percy's sword, it should have reappeared by now. The magic must not work in Tartarus. He would have needed to have fallen with it on him. It couldn't transport over the domains. A tear dropped out of her eye straight onto the dirty floor. Percy was unarmed. Alone, injured, falling. Into Tartarus. Hazel and Jason had to help her to her feet. Normally she would push them off, do it herself, but Annabeth felt as if she had just reached her breaking point. She just got him back after 8 months of searching. She'd had him in her arms. She could still feel the ghost of his hands in hers, and now he'd been taken from her again. She had reached the point that her head hurt from crying and knew she was dehydrating herself. She knew it, and she hated it. She couldn't turn her thoughts off, her brain reminding her of facts and figures, stuff she knew about the place. She wished she didn't know a goddamn thing. They practically carried her compliant body to the waiting ship. Leo shifted uncomfortably by the ladder. He darted forward and picked up Riptide. He would keep it safe for Percy when he got back. If he got back, no, he would. Leo shook his head, still not quite comprehending what he had just seen. He couldn't believe it. Percy seemed like the type of guy who was polished, indestructible. He could make it through Tartarus. He was the son of Poseidon for Hades' sake. Kid of one of the big three, that had to mean something. He tried not to think about it. He couldn't help but feel guilty. Leo knew it was his fault. He should have gotten everyone safely on board the Argo II before he started securing the statue. He should have realized the cavern floor was unstable. He stood back and watched as Jason used his air powers to support a crumpling Annabeth on the ladder. She looked devastated, and Leo truly felt sorry for her and Percy. Seeing how she was when she was searching for Percy the first time had been bad enough. Nico followed her, refusing help with a death glare. It would have been effective if he wasn't crying too. Silent tears fell down his face and he brushed them off roughly with his jacket sleeve. He looked a lot younger than he acted, and Leo felt a little of the animosity he felt for the son of Hades slip away. Hazel nudged him, her eyes glassy. Leo snapped into action. He bypassed the ladder to reach his own private ladder, summoned by a device on his tool belt. More of the floor was cracking away, it was about to collapse, and the further they got away from a massive hole leading to certain death, Leo winced. Not certain, he amended the better. Grabbing a wee nunchuck, he jerked it upwards, getting the heavy ship away from the floor and away from the whole building. Frank and Piper came to stand by him. Both looked in shock and sniffed occasionally, but otherwise remained silent as they flew away, until Annabeth passed out, mumbled Hazel, stumbling through a doorway. Nico's with her. Leo wasn't surprised. She had looked dead on her feet from the moment they had seen her. Coach Hedge looked miserable. He kept packing the deck with tears in his eyes, pulling at his goatee and slapping the side of his head, muttering, "I should have saved him, I should have blown up more stuff." He looked terrified at the thought of Tartarus. Leo remembered Nico's words about Tartarus and the doors. He had said that Gia's minions were at their strongest in Tartarus and could reform extremely quickly after they were killed. He frowned. That would be a big problem if Percy even survived the fall. Oh gods, the fall, how would he break his fall? Wouldn't he just splat? Leo winced. Maybe he'd create some water to guide himself down, landing at the bottom, preferably near the doors. Nico had told them that in order to reset the doors of death so that monsters couldn't just come straight back, someone must physically go into Tartarus and cut the chains on that side as well as their side. It had seemed impossible and nobody had had any idea of where to even start. They hadn't even considered going down there. Nico said it was practically impossible as even he, a son of Hades, had barely survived Tartarus. None of the gods, including Thanatos, the god of death himself, would go there. But now Percy was down there facing the task. Although he had huge respect for the guy, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't see Percy again. It bugged him from a little corner of his brain. It was Tartarus, the hell of hell, the pit of the pit, the deepest and darkest part of the underworld, etc., etc. And he was still just a teenager despite how powerful he was. Nico nearly went insane in Tartarus. He told him that time moved differently, there wasn't really a way to keep track. A day up here could be a week, a month, a year down there. He kept his depressing thoughts to himself, though, as more people came onto the deck a little while later. Frank wrapped Hazel up in a bear hug and she burrowed into him. Piper rested her head on Leo's shoulder as he got them flying at a slightly quicker pace. "Where are we going again?" he asked. "Back to Camp Half-Blood," Annabeth answered from the door. Everyone turned around as she stepped through. Her face was blotchy and her eyes were still wet, but she had that determined look back in her eyes. Leo thought that she could do with going back to sleep. "We need to get as much help as possible for the doors of death, and we need the gods. Now we have the Parthenos, we can unite the camps," she continued. "Won't we run out of time?" Leo said. "How long until Gaia is supposed to rise?" "I don't know, maybe a month, a couple weeks max," Annabeth rubbed her temples. "Otis said Gaia would rise on August 1st, Jason stated, so we have a month. "We just have to form a truce between Romans and Greeks so that the gods won't have their identity crisis anymore," said Annabeth. "They can help us find Percy and close the doors of death." "Easy then," Leo said dryly, trying to add some light to the day. No one laughed, typical, though even he didn't feel like laughing. "Anyway," he added hastily, "where are these doors of death then?" "Nico went looking for them, didn't he?" responded Piper. Hazel raised her head in the corner of Leo's eye, looking like large weights were clinging to her eyes. "I know where they are," Hazel said. "They're chained down in the House of Hades. It's an underground temple in Epirus." Leo blinked. "And where's that?" he whispered to Piper. "Greece," Piper told him quietly. Leo pulled a screen out from nowhere. It was always handy to have a spare screen for whatever use. He typed in the coordinates quickly, fingers tapping soothingly against the thick glass, or at least that was what Leo thought. It was probably annoying to the others. It loaded for a few seconds before results flashed up. "From where we are now, Rome to New York is about, yikes, 7,000 kilometers. That means traveling at our current pace." Leo tapped a few calculations out on the interactive glass. "We should arrive in just over a week." "But then we've got to come back as well," Piper reminded. She was chewing on her lip. "Double it, just under 3 weeks, then add how long it takes to get from Rome to Epirus." More tapping. "Add another day or so. Overall, it'll take us quite a bit of time to grab soldiers, get the gods, and then fly back across the ocean to meet Percy at the doors of death." "There's got to be a better way," Frank said, running his hands through his hair. Leo frowned. Why was he suddenly in charge? Gods, he missed Percy already. Annabeth turned to him with a glint in her gray eyes that Leo knew by now meant she wanted something from him. "Okay," Leo held up his hands in surrender. "Theoretically, we could go faster. But we got some serious hits to the ship. I'll get to fixing it straight away, but I don't think we can suffer too many attacks without parts starting to break." "We don't know long it will take Percy to reach the doors," Hazel added sadly, looking like she was trying to remember everything Nico had told her. Annabeth bit her lip, torn. "I mean, I'd like to go straight to the doors to get him, but logically we'd better have the gods on our side before rushing in there. We might get trapped or overrun and we can't help him like that. The more people the better, even if there's only 7 of us in this stupid prophecy." Leo was slightly confused at everything going on, but threw everything aside to focus purely on the numbers and the mechanics. That's what he was here for, after all. They had to get back to camp quickly. Okay, he could do that. With a flick of a button, a sidestep of a dance mat, and a swish of a Wii remote, they shot back across Italy, heading for Camp Half-Blood in silence. Chapter 2. Percy. Percy kept his eyes open as long as he could to keep Annabeth in his sight. He could still hear screams, though they grew more distant by the second as he plummeted into the unknown. When she faded from view, he kept his eyes open just so he could see the faintly shrinking square of light above. But eventually the air pushed them shut, drying them out immediately, and he was left to his descent in darkness. He knew a hard landing was awaiting him, the harshest there could be, but on some level he was weirdly okay with that. He had saved Annabeth. And right now, that seemed to be the only thing keeping him from absolutely freaking out. He seemed to fall for an age. At times, the temperature changed. One minute he was plummeting through hot sauna-like air, clogging his nose and mouth, the next a chilly wind that set his teeth on edge. At other times he heard noises, clicking and cackling all around him, yet as silent as the dead at others. He wondered how long he had been falling. He didn't have a good concept on how long it took to freefall through the earth itself, 10 minutes or 10 days. The hurtling pushed his bad arm backwards, and in the worst flipping head over heels moments where he had no control, the sheer force of falling wrenched the bone into painful angles, waving like a broken string puppet. Percy gritted his teeth. At one point during his fall, he had extended his other arm, fumbling in the dark like a blind man, hoping to at least find some way of slowing his shooting descent. He had started to think this out, and he knew he needed to find some traction or something to catch himself on. There was no way he would survive if he landed normally. He had hoped that the walls would still be smooth so he could at least hold on to something, maybe even slide his way down like some kind of twisted play park. But the surface had shifted again, this time into jagged chunks of rock, and he had hissed as it tore up the palm of his hand upon contact. Gaia's voice floated in and out of his head, a lonely whisper he couldn't escape. He could always hear her words despite barely being able to hear his own yells. Sometimes it was crackling laughter like a lost radio losing signal. "All good things will come to an end, my little pawn," she said to him. "Be what you will become, you will serve me in the end. I will be ready to use you soon enough." Then silence. After a few minutes or hours or days, Percy had no idea he felt a shift below him. As if there was an actual surface beneath him and he wasn't going to just keep falling forever. Being the son of Poseidon, he knew it was water. Or some kind of distorted version, he reflected, feeling that it seemed well denser than normal water, like the Dead Sea, only saltier. He gathered his inner strength and pulled it towards himself like an elastic band. By now, Percy felt like a comet. He wouldn't be surprised if he was on fire. He needed something to catch him, or he'd end up making a crater with a demigod pancake inside. The feeling of the water got closer and closer until the cavern he was shooting like a lightning bolt down in grew lighter. The light was a dark red like the glow of fire, and Percy couldn't help but be relieved that he could at least see his hand in front of his face. Then the rest was revealed. Red clouds hung around in the air like vaporized blood. The landscape was rocky black plains, punctuated by jagged mountains and fiery chasms. Random sections of ground were just ablaze, flickering wildly in the distance. There was a river twisting up to catch him like a snake being charmed out of its box, the same feeling of water he had been stretching up towards him. It was a ribbon of glittering black liquid, smelling distinctly of sulfur. Percy held his breath, readying for impact, not knowing if he could breathe in whatever kind of river this was. He hit the column of water head-on. It caught him with a painful slap across the face. Percy gasped, a little dazed, then inhaled. Okay, Percy thought in relief he could breathe. That was always good. Though the water was so cold Percy hesitated to breathe it in, could felt it seep into his skin. He lowered himself via the inky stream down to the river's surface, teeth chattering. His feet hit the river bed, buffered slightly by the slow current. He had made it, his feet were on the ground. Percy shook his head in disbelief. He hadn't expected this at all. What would he do now? The bleak thought hit him out of nowhere, but Percy frowned as he actually thought about it, his head barely breaking the surface of the water. He was stuck down here, stuck in Tartarus, the place where the bad monsters locked up the worse monsters. And for the first time, Percy realized he was completely alone. He was the only demigod, Hades the only mortal down there. No gods could save him this time. No one would come get him. It would be suicide to follow him. Suicide to even be down here in the first place, Percy thought glumly. Things would just get worse if he left the river. Everyone would try to kill him. He was basically public enemy number one down here. He may as well paint a target on his forehead to begin with. Was it even worth getting to the doors? Hades, was it even worth getting out? Life was just one misery after another, and this was just one in a long line of bad things to happen to him. Death and suffering, torture and pain, it never seemed to stop in the life of a demigod. Percy felt himself start to sink, his soul weighing heavily on his chest. He knew that even if he got out, he'd never be happy again. Millions of heartbroken voices echoed in his head as if the river were made of distilled sadness. Percy wanted to retreat into himself. He didn't want to be a demigod, never had, and he didn't want to be in a prophecy. He just wanted to be a normal kid. A normal kid whose father wasn't a god, who couldn't stay dry when submerged in a river, who couldn't breathe underwater. He needed to escape, to go home, hide away from the world, from everyone who wanted something from him, who wanted him to do something for them, from everyone he had failed to save, from everyone he still would fail to save. Bodies piled up in his mind from Camp Half-Blood, from Camp Jupiter, his family, his friends, Annabeth. He couldn't save her. He didn't know why he'd ever tried to convince himself that he could. Demigods didn't live past their late teens. It was obvious what would happen. She'd die and then he'd die. She didn't deserve to die first. But he did. It felt like the river turned to ice around his head. Percy breathed in slowly. A fog descended upon his brain. Life was a long misery and he just didn't want to do it anymore. He was done. He'd spent years not breathing in water, long before everything, before he knew the truth. He just had to get back to that. He just had to block out what he was. He just had to. The water around his face seemed to solidify. This was it, he thought, his limbs so heavy that they felt like they were made of stone. His head sank to the bottom of the riverbed and he gazed up at the darkness through the waves like it was the night sky. End of the line. Last stop. Better luck next time. If he was crying, he didn't feel the tears against his face. He closed his eyes and took in a great gulp of water straight into his lungs. His eyes flew open and he hacked a great cough as his nose burned, spluttering, inhaling more water, choking on it. Black blobs starting to creep into his eyes, long dormant adrenaline flooding his veins, something tugging in his gut. The river exploded as he clawed at his throat. He burst bodily out of the waves, crawling onto the stony river bank, shredding his hands on the glass-like rocks. He threw up the water violently, his chest jerking. As the water drained out of his ears, the world snapped back into clarity. He had nearly let himself drown. Again. Only a knee-jerk reaction had saved him. All of those thoughts that had been in his head, it was like they were his own, just magnified tenfold. He swallowed and tried to not think about it. It was a lot warmer out of the river, a lot warmer. Already he could feel some sweat beads on his upper lip from the muggy air. Percy shakily stood, unwillingly crying out as he put weight on his broken arm. It was loud in the eerie hush of Tartarus. The water seemed to have set it, which was good, but the skin around it was turning a yellowy green, suggesting a deep bruise forming. Okay, right, Tartarus. Feeling a little lost, he went through his extensive supplies, which astonishingly consisted of nothing. That was it. Well, if that wasn't an emergency, Percy didn't know what was. He automatically checked his pockets as well, frowning when he noticed a lack of a certain pen, doing the pocket dance his mother did sometimes when she couldn't find her keys. A kind of frenzied slapping. It wasn't on him, but he wrote it off. It always returned. He coughed slightly, feeling a sharp tickle in the back of his throat, and prayed he didn't just get some kind of Tartarus-ish cholera from the river water. Rubbing his throat, he scanned the humongous red and black pit, as much as he could see anyway. God's New York could probably fit in the section he was in about 10 times over. It seemed to go on for hundreds of miles in every direction. The sun's absence was more noticeable than he'd imagined, like he was stood in the vast shadow of something huge. He could see okay, but the darkness meant that little things like the lines on his palms were difficult to see in the low light. He blinked and looked around in a wide circle, just coming to terms with where he actually was. Holy Hera. He'd never actually thought, well, he wasn't sure what he had thought. Maybe that Tartarus was empty space, a pit with no bottom. Monsters just appeared as gold dust, reformed, and then were thrown back out to go terrorize some mortals. But it was a real place. His feet were walking on solid ground, he was breathing real air. He certainly wasn't in Kansas anymore. Percy glanced around, the feeling of being watched prickling up his neck like a spider. With so much darkness and shadows, any monsters watching him would be virtually indistinguishable. Great, just great. That was honestly the exact thing that he needed right then. Deciding not to wait for something to inevitably come and try to kill him, Percy took a path that led away from the icy river, walking down a descending slope of rock. He felt sure that if he was going to find the doors of death, they'd be in the deepest part of the pit. He coughed again, his chest tight. He couldn't shake the bad feeling that flicked his eyes from side to side. Supposed to be monster central and not one monster in sight. He wished he could talk to Annabeth. She'd know what to do. Percy racked his brains as he walked quickly, hopping over a ridge and weaving around a violent-looking red stalagmite. If he was going to find the exact location of the doors of death, well, that was easy enough. He just had to find some monsters and follow them. Coughing, Percy searched his pockets again, his hands gripping air. Riptide wasn't there. This time he frowned for real. The last time he had it, he had cut the web with it. It had been in his hands then. He was falling, his arm had broken. Percy winced, and then he had been hanging on. It hadn't been in his hands then. He must have dropped it. Did it not make it down to Tartarus? Great. Well, that left Percy unarmed and he began thinking of ways to improvise, rubbing his neck slightly as the skin tingled a little painfully. A roar caught his attention in the far distance and inspiration struck. He smiled slightly as he remembered the fight with the Minotaur from when he was younger. What had he used as a weapon back then? The Minotaur's own horn. Yeah, that was it. That story had been told so many times over campfires, Percy had begun to leave whenever they started it. So what nearby had easily snappable or sharp features? A stalagmite, a sharp rock. Percy briefly pictured him making a shiv out of his shoe. At least he'd have both Nike and Adidas on his side. Percy snorted to himself, but it quickly turned into a splutter as he choked on something in the back of his throat. He lifted a hand to muffle his coughs. Warm liquid splattered onto the palm of his hand. Percy glanced down and froze in complete confusion. His hands were dotted with blood. His abnormally red hands. His gaze followed his arms and found them a vivid shade of red too, and he watched in horror as blisters began to form in front of his very eyes. He could see the skin reddening with every breath he took. Every inhale seemed to burn his lungs, and a tickling sensation told him something had just dribbled out of the corner of his mouth. What was wrong with him? Was it the river he'd been in? Did he actually have cholera? Percy wiped it away and carried on walking, breaking into a hasty sprint every time he heard a noise. And there were plenty of noises. It had been uncomfortably quiet when he had pulled himself from the river, but the further he walked, the more he could hear. Roaring from various different places, fire crackling, thunder in the far distance that sounded eerily like laughter, the crunch of the sharp rocks under his tired feet, and occasionally a familiar high-pitched giggle from behind him which would make him spin around to find nothing. Percy inhaled sharply suddenly as he saw something in the distance. 100 feet away, a familiar-looking baby blue Italian car had crashed headfirst into the sand. It looked just like the Fiat that had smashed into Arachne and sent her plummeting into the pit. Percy hoped he was wrong, but how many Italian sports cars could there be in Tartarus? Part of him didn't want to go anywhere near it, but he had to find out. He stumbled toward the wreckage. One of the car's tires had come off, long gone. The Fiat's windows had shattered, sending brighter glass like frosting across the dark ground. Under the crushed hood lay the tattered, glistening remains of a giant silk cocoon, the trap that Annabeth had tricked Arachne into weaving. It was unmistakably empty. Slash marks in the sand made a trail downriver, as if something heavy with multiple legs had scuttled into the darkness. Arachne was alive. Percy scowled angrily in outrage. Of course she had made it unharmed. His life wouldn't be at its normal level of unfair if she had died. Or maybe she had, he thought morbidly. Tartarus was monster home court. Down here maybe they couldn't be killed. Percy blinked. This kind of thinking wouldn't help him. Maybe she was just badly wounded and had crawled away to die. He liked the sound of that a lot more. Percy checked the car over carefully before he opened a side door. It grated against the buckled car frame with a metallic whine and fell off its hinges in his hand, landing on the ground with a loud crash that made him wince. He stuck his head inside to look for anything he could use. But the glove box had been compacted to dust, the leather seats flayed into shreds, and any sharp bits of metal were firmly crushed together. He couldn't get them out without tearing his hands up. Majority of the car and its content was unusable, save for a crumpled but surprisingly solid plastic water bottle crammed under a seat. It crackled as he strapped it to his jeans with the longest piece of leather he could find. Now at least he had something to fill with his lack of water, he mused, before turning in the opposite direction to the crashed car. He had been walking for he guessed about an hour by the time he found his first monster. There had been movement above him and Percy had barely enough time to duck behind a stalagmite before he could be spotted. He peered around the edge, his hand unconsciously reaching for his missing sword. It was the biggest Stymphalian bird he'd ever seen, preening a metallic feather under its wing with its bronze beak. Percy held his breath, hoping it would fly off and leave him to his walking, but he cursed under his breath as he saw it sniff the air several times, beady black eyes darting in his direction. It shrieked, flapping into the air, and Percy rolled to the side as it landed with a mighty sweep of its wings onto the stalagmite he had been crouched behind. With no weapon available, Percy panicked. At the wolf house, Lupa had trained him to fight without a weapon. It was the first thing he had learned. Riptide held loosely in Lupa's teeth as she watched him using only his speed to avoid the baying pack at his heels, or only his strength, his hands buried wrist-deep in fur as he pushed a wolf's snapping jaws away from his face. He could hear her now. A wolf who cannot fight without its claws or teeth is a dead wolf. Percy tried to remember that as he punched the bird squarely in the face. It screamed, and he took that as his cue to back off just a little as it slid down the stone. While it was distracted, Percy reached blindly behind him, grabbing the first small rock his fingertips came into contact with, and lobbed it as hard as he could at the bird's metal beak. The clang echoed like a gong. It caught in indignation and flung a couple lethal feathers like knives in Percy's direction. But he was already on the move, ducking smoothly under the projectiles and leaping onto the bird's back. An avian cry erupted from its beak trying to shake him off, but Percy had a leg pressing down on its wings, stopping it from taking off with him on its back. His broken arm screamed in agony. He strained, wrapping his good arm around the spindly neck. His blistered skin stung like acid. Keeping it immobile, he jabbed it hard in the eye with his elbow. And the bird hopped around in pain, causing Percy's teeth to clack together like he was on the worst buckaroo in the world. His butt was beginning to ache. He kept punching the bird, his knuckles clanging against the metal beak before leaning back with his whole body, pulling the neck back as far as he could. He braced himself, ready to make the final snap, and pressed his bad arm to his ribs to steady it. With a jerk of his arm, he broke the Stymphalian bird's neck, and the whole monster turned to dust. Percy landed on his feet, watching with disappointment as the feathers that had been shot as him dissolved. He could have used those. He needed a weapon. Fighting with his bare hands was something he could do okayish, but not against more than a few monsters, and if the howls and shrieks he could hear in the distance meant anything, he would be way out of his depth soon enough. The throbbing in his arm kept him alert as he kept walking, losing his step every now and then as he slipped and slid his way down unexpected drops in the decline. His head had been growing foggier and foggier, his skin going from a bright red to choked purple. He tried to keep his coughs to a minimum. Something was definitely wrong with him. All too soon he found himself traveling through a valley, feeling on edge at being so exposed, and he quickened his pace. Maybe the sooner he found more monsters, the sooner he could get some food, a weapon, or some kind of cure for whatever was burning his skin. He reckoned if he conserved his energy enough, he could create some water to tide him over like at Riordan's ranch. He certainly wouldn't be going back to the first river for a drink. As he climbed up a small incline, another river loomed menacingly ahead of Percy. It was a river of fire cutting a path through a jagged obsidian crevasse, the glowing red current casting horrible shadows across the cliff faces. Even from his distance, the heat was intense. The chill of the first river hadn't quite left his bones, but now his face felt raw and sunburned. Every breath took more effort, as if his chest was filled with marshmallows. The cuts on his hands bled more rather than less. It wasn't the first river, it was a different one. There were 5 rivers in Tartarus, that Percy was 100% sure about, but the names escaped him sometimes. There was the Styx, the Lethe, something to do with forgetting things. Oh, the irony, Percy thought as he tripped over a shard that protruded from the spiky floor, his body getting heavier with each layer of blisters. Yes, the Lethe wiped memories. Another one started with C2, more the aching tum, whatever. And the last river, the one that was rudely unpronounceable, something to do with phlegm. The river in front of him definitely gave him freaky Tartarus phlegm vibes, severely different from the first river at his back. This river was a golden color. It flicked like a livelier kind of lava and seemed to be glowing, parts of the glassy ground on the banks melting like toffee on a hot day. A coughing fit overtook Percy and he crumpled to his knees, crawling over to the bank of the river. He couldn't keep walking. Not anymore. His head was fuzzy and light, and when he blinked, it took a while for Percy to see again. Percy pulled himself into a sitting position and stared at the water. He hadn't been coughing or blistering when he had been in the first river, he thought dimly. Water healed him, didn't it? Why should this be any different? Just because the water looked a lot like fire, it didn't mean it still wasn't water, did it? But Percy couldn't keep his eyes open any longer. A wave of black rolled over him and suddenly the ground was turning towards his face, slamming into his cheek. It took him a second or two for his brain to catch up. He was face down, his strength giving out. Percy had been poisoned before by the chimera, the feeling was familiar. He'd been poisoned somehow, but his mind was too foggy to connect the dots at the moment. Water would heal him. This fire thing moved like water. It was that or choke on his own blood and die. Even in his addled state, Percy could recognize the better option. Giving in, he reached out towards the river before dipping a hesitant finger into the waves. Holy Hera, it burned. He jerked his hand back instantly with his hiss, but watched confused as the burns disappeared. His skin turned back to normal and a brief drop of energy spread through his body. Watching the water flowing, Percy warily dipped his broken arm into the stream. Percy groaned out loud, rolling onto his back to get out of the water. It seared deeply into his skin, agony at first, but then less so. One dip at a time, gritting his teeth until he almost thought they'd shatter, Percy purged whatever airborne poison had seeped into his skin out of him. The relief was quick, yet the cough still plagued him even after he had splashed his face in the river. He'd coughed up blood enough times to know that whatever was happening to him was internal. His lungs or his throat, he guessed, now more coherent. It had to be the air. Which meant this was going to suck. He winced as cinders sprayed from the river, curling around his face. Percy braced himself, taking short but deep breaths, then he pushed both his hands straight into the river. On first contact, the fire wasn't painful. It felt cold, which was probably worse than being boiling, like when he had once touched an iron as a kid and he hadn't realized it was hot until it had burned him. Moving before he lost his nerve, he scooped up enough to roast the palms of his two hands and raised it to his mouth, hurriedly gulping down the liquid fire. His nose and mouth instantly filled with liquid flame. His tongue felt like it was being deep-fried. His throat was scorched and he retched, gagging on the taste, throwing out his now empty hands to balance himself as he pulled a wretched face, nearly falling in. He panted in the heat. The air was hot enough already, being near the fire river was alike to sitting by the coals in a sauna. Spicy yet disgusting, Percy mumbled hoarsely to himself. He felt horribly weak and nauseous, but his next breath came more easily. The blisters on his arms were starting to fade. He stared at his healing skin in shock before filling up the crinkled plastic bottle with the water, which surprisingly held up. He might need it later. The water may have healed him and given him strength, kept him alive, but it didn't do anything for his hunger or thirst, which meant he'd have to keep looking for food or he'd go insane from his stomach rumbling. God's Tartarus was lethal without even trying. How was he supposed to get around if he couldn't even breathe without combusting from the inside? He took a breath, his lungs felt a lot emptier. Even his arm seemed more not broken, now developing into the dark black bruise stage. He shuddered to think what the river might have done to him if he wasn't the son of Poseidon. Curiously, Percy raised a hand and flicked it outwards. The river responded by moving the same way, throwing a flame in the same direction. Okay, that was good. He could still control the rivers down here, control the water, and if he didn't have a weapon, then this was the next best thing. Percy made a small noise of satisfaction and continued to bottle his fire up. Damn, and I was so hoping you'd die from the air, whined a chatty voice behind him, and he spun around on his feet instantly. Oh no. The Impausa Kelly stood before him, in all her cheerleader glory, with her now filthy red and white striped crop top, vividly saying "Go team," and the hairy donkey leg that didn't quite fit the look. She had two more behind her, but they had dented plastic shin pads on instead, looking as if they'd just been playing cricket. His eyes widened a little as he saw a carcass of some monster behind them. Nothing left except a few splintered bones and glistening stains drying in the heat of the river. Percy had no doubt the Impausi would devour demigods with the same gusto. "Do we have time for this?" said one of the Impausa next to Kelly with a gravelly and ancient voice, a startling contrast to the valley girl voice Kelly seemed to have permanently adopted since Percy had fought her 2 or 3 years ago. "I think I definitely have time for Percy Jackson," Kelly cooed. "How totally awesome is this? Now I don't even have to return to the mortal world to destroy you." "How convenient for you," Percy said, wishing for the billionth time that he was armed. "Just kill this demigod and let's move on," said another Impausa behind her. "I wonder," said the other, "if you are stalling. Perhaps you do not know the way to the doors, young one." "Oh, shut your fang hole," said Kelly. "You even know who he is, or are you that old? When's the last time you escaped to the mortal world?" "Huh, I know what I'm on about. I was there a couple of years ago, well, until I met this little hero here that was." All eyes turned back to Percy, who could feel his improvisational skills being pushed to their limit. So he started clapping his sore hands together. "I guess you're wondering what I'm doing in Tartarus." Kelly glared at him. "Not really, I just want to kill you." You know, the Titan War is over, right?" Percy asked. "You lost? Ring any bells, or did you miss that while you were down here? Killing me isn't exactly trendy right now, you see, and I kind of need to go." "So the Titans lost?" Kelly snapped. "Fine, that was part of the plan to wake Gaia anyway. Now the Earth Mother and her giants will destroy the mortal world and we will totally feast on demigods." The other vampires gnashed their teeth in a frenzy of excitement. Percy had been in the middle of a school of sharks when the water was full of blood. That wasn't nearly as scary as Impausi ready to feed. He'd seen them devour carcasses in seconds. He prepared to attack, but how many could he dispatch before they overwhelmed him? It wouldn't be enough. Briefly, Percy considered calling for Mrs. O'Leary, his hellhound friend who could shadow travel. Even if she heard him, could she make it into Tartarus? This was where monsters went when they died. Calling her here might kill her or turn her back to her natural state as a fierce monster. No, he couldn't do that to his dog. So no help, fighting was a long shot. "I promise you, attacking me isn't the best idea for you right now," he tried to sound earnest. "You kill me and go up to the surface, you won't make it 5 minutes before the Greek and Roman army avenges me and you end up right back here. The Impulsi backed up nervously, hissing Romany. Percy raised his eyebrows. He guessed they'd had experience with the 12th Legion before and it hadn't worked out too well for them. Yeah, you bet Romany. Percy bared his forearm and showed them the tattoo he'd gotten at Camp Jupiter, the SBQR mark with the trident of Neptune. You mix Greek and Roman and you know what you get bam. He stomped his foot and the Impulsi scrambled back. One fell off the boulder where she'd been perched. That made Percy feel good, but they recovered quickly and closed in again. Bold talk, Kelly said, for a demigod lost in Tartarus. Get on your knees, Percy Jackson, and I'll kill you quickly. Believe me, there are worse ways to die down here. You know I won't do that, Percy said, eyes flicking as they got closer to him. For 2 years I churned in the void, Kelly said. Do you know how completely annoying it is to be vaporized, Perseus Jackson? Slowly reforming, fully conscious in searing pain for months and years as your body regrows, then finally breaking the crust of this hellish place and clawing your way back to daylight. All because Percy freakin' Jackson's little girlfriend stabbed you in the back. Her name is Annabeth, he interjected. Her baleful eyes held Percy's. I wonder what happens if a demigod is killed in Tartarus. I doubt it's ever happened before, let's find out. Percy attempted a winning smile, but it fell flat in the face of Kelly's anger. The Impulsa bared her fangs at him, her true vampiric form on show. Percy cringed at her dead, ashy skin, pointed teeth, hoof and her other, bronze, prosthetic, leg. Oh. Despite death being a mere 10 feet away, Percy almost laughed in her furious face. Oh, now this was going to be a challenge. I thought the Cocytus would get you, then the monsters, but if even the air won't get you then I guess we'll have to kill you ourselves. Kelly snarled, interrupting Percy's crazed inner plan-making, her hair aflame with fury. He held up his index finger to deliberately antagonize her, and to buy him more time to think of a way to carry out his absolutely insane plan. Wait, hold on, he said, I'm thinking. The Impulsi stopped stalking forwards and their jaws dropped. How dare why? SHHH, Percy responded, placing a hand on his chin in a thoughtful pose. He stroked an imaginary beard, trying to imitate Grover twirling his own wispy one. Kelly seemed as if steam could come out her ears at any second. If looks could kill, he'd be 6 feet underground. Well, he'd be whatever was 6 feet under the bottom of the underworld. Kelly'd had enough? She lunged with a shriek, fangs bared, and though she was wicked fast, he was a lot better than he was a couple years ago, and Percy ducked to the side. With a hook of his foot, he swept her legs out from under her. She screamed in frustration as she was flipped. Percy went to grab her leg, but she retaliated quickly and kicked him in the chest with her donkey hoof, causing him to wheeze for a second as the others closed in on him. He punched one in the face, dodging as the other tried to bite into his neck and delivering a strong kick to the back of the monster's knees. Kelly was on her feet again, red eyes flashing, and the trio hissed at him. Percy held his fists up, willing to keep fighting them with his bare hands, but had a flash of inspiration. With a twist of his wrist, 2 spurts of water launched out of both the fire river and the Cocytus, 2 Impulse howling as water blasted into them. Kelly clearly didn't care about her sisters as she didn't even spare them a glance before swinging at Percy. He caught her fist, punching her in the throat, wincing as she lashed out with her donkey leg again, stamping on his foot. Her fangs sank briefly into his bicep and he sucked in a breath between his teeth, shaking her off. Around them, the air got hazy and Percy knew she was trying to manipulate the mist. He had to end this quickly before she tried to charm speak him. Catching Kelly in a headlock, barely avoiding her sinking her fangs into his chest, he jerked her forwards, flipping her head over heels again. Wasting no time, he leaned forwards and yanked her fake leg off, his arm still jolting in pain. The leg was jagged along one side from her exploits, sharp enough for what he needed. The Impulsi all gaped at him, the 2 he had blasted with water slowly getting up, looking very red and very sad. Kelly was still left on the ground trying to get up. This should be good enough, Percy mused out loud and swung it at the nearest monster, catching it across the chest. It burst into a golden powder that got carried off in some kind of breeze, probably to go reform somewhere in the burning pit. It made Percy briefly wonder if he'd see it again down in Tartarus. Kelly screeched, trying to get back up on her one remaining leg, as Percy, now happy to finally have a weapon, destroyed the other Impulsa, who hadn't even made a move against him. He turned to her, grinning, holding his new weapon aloft. "Beware my new weapon," he said, shaking it above her wide eyes. All the gods fear its power. You have got to be kidding me, she hissed at him, lunging forward to swipe pathetically with her razor-sharp claws wobbling on her one hoof. Percy's grin widened as he knocked her back down for the third and final time, hoisting the bronze leg into the air. He nodded, face going completely serious. I'm just pulling your leg, he said before swinging her own limb back at her. She too exploded, and Percy ducked the cloud of gold that grazed his light t-shirt, damp sweat patches congregating around his back and chest. He wished he was wearing his armor, but they'd been in a rush to save Nico. He dusted himself off and looked around, grinning. I can't believe no one else heard that, Percy said to himself. Then, flipping the makeshift weapon over his shoulder with his good arm, he kept walking the way he was going, staying close to the fiery river. He had some doors to find. Chapter 3. Percy II. He was no child of Hephaestus, but Percy thought his makeshift sword was pretty cool. He had used the liquid fire from the river to help melt down Kelly's leg into a passable sword shape. It could now be held easily in one hand, and the many stones around him had given an effective way to file the sides and top so they were relatively sharp and sword-like, a rudimentary point. Percy was just grateful to have a weapon in his hand again, infinitely more reassured that he wouldn't die instantly if he was jumped by something. He swung it around in his good hand, testing out the balance, or lack of it. It was crude and weighted around the middle, but it would do the job, he guessed. The celestial bronze blade glowed brighter than normal in the gloom of Tartarus. As it passed through the thick hot air, it made a defiant hiss like a riled snake. He knew he couldn't stay by the fire river forever. He'd been walking alongside it for ages, but the light made him too easy to spot in the darkness. The Olympus had found him, the Stymphalian bird too. He knew he reeked of demigod, of a big three demigod as well, and that usually attracted monsters like crazy. He needed to get himself moving away from the river. Bracing himself, he choked down a little more of the liquid fire to repair his arm and refilled his bottle to the brim. Percy sighed, sitting on his heels. He hated this place already. Everything was so dark and on edge, he just wanted to go home. After being taken away by Hera for so long, all he'd wanted was to be with his friends and family, but no, of course he had to be in the prophecy. Another great prophecy to boot. Didn't he deserve a break? His stomach rumbled. He'd been down there for a while now, and he felt like it had shrunk to the size of a gumdrop. If he came across any more monster carcasses, he was afraid he might pull an impausa and try to devour it. Maybe by some miracle it would taste just like fried chicken. He doubted he could find any ketchup though. He wondered if he would die of starvation or if the firewater would keep him going. He remembered the punishment of Tantalus, who'd been permanently stuck in a pool of water under a fruit tree but couldn't reach either food or drink. Geez, Percy hadn't thought about Tantalus in years. That stupid guy had been paroled briefly to serve as director at Camp Half-Blood. Probably he was back in the fields of punishment. Percy had never felt sorry for the jerk before, but now he was starting to sympathize. He could imagine what it would be like, getting hungrier and hungrier for eternity but never being able to eat. Percy's heart crept into his throat as he glanced off the edge of a small nearby cliff, leading to a deeper section of Tartarus. The fire river flowed in torrents down the side, a strange waterfall of fire. If the doors were going to be anywhere, he'd bet that they were down there. But even if he reached the bottom of that descent alive, he knew he didn't have much to look forward to. The landscape below him was a bleak ash-gray plain bristling with black trees like insect hair. The ground was pocked with blisters. Every once in a while, a bubble would swell and burst, disgorging a monster like a larva from an egg, a little black mark in the distance. Suddenly Percy wasn't hungry anymore. He saw all the newly formed monsters crawling and hobbling in the same direction, toward a bank of black fog that swallowed the horizon like a storm front. The fiery phlegm river flowed in the same direction until about halfway across the plain, where it met another river of black water, maybe the Cocytus. The two floods combined in a steaming, boiling cataract and flowed on as one toward the black fog. Above him, dark winged shapes spiraled in and out of the blood-red clouds. He gazed across the ashen plains. The other titans were supposed to be here in Tartarus, maybe bound in chains or roaming aimlessly or hiding in some of those dark crevices. Percy and his allies had destroyed the worst titan, Kronos, but even his remains might be down here somewhere. A billion angry titan particles floating through the blood-colored clouds or lurking in that dark fog. Percy decided not to think about that. The longer Percy looked into that storm of darkness, the less he wanted to go there. It could be hiding anything, an ocean, a bottomless pit, an army of monsters. But if the doors of death were in that direction, it was his only chance to get home. He'd have no choice but to walk into the darkness and pray that the monsters hadn't been eating their carrots lately. It could be worse, Percy told himself, racking his brain for a worst-case scenario that was actually worse than where he was now. He could have fallen into the Lethe instead of the Cocytus. Percy's skin crawled just thinking about it. He'd had enough trouble with amnesia for one lifetime. A few years before, he'd fought a titan on the banks of the Lethe near Hades' palace. He'd blasted the titan with water from that river and completely wiped his memory clean. What had he told him his new name was? Bob, Percy said aloud, snorting slightly, and for a split second his mood went from terrible to slightly less terrible. The sound of a stone clattering across the ground sharpened his hearing to the left, and his head whipped round. Percy rolled, ducking behind a huge rock, pulling his bruised arm close and peered out, ready to strike or flee or whatever came to mind first. It could have been a simple rock fall, but Percy wasn't naive enough to believe that. His suspicions were confirmed when a dark shadow moved into the flickering light from the fire river. It was a single Dracena. It wandered close, looking around. Percy narrowed his eyes. Having fought armies of the humanoid females in the Titan War, he had developed a hatred of the foot soldiers of Kronos, from their hissing tongues to their twin serpent trunk legs. It sniffed the air. Now armed, Percy felt almost eager to kill it. Leaning to the side, his head now visible, the monster made eye contact with Percy. Its eyes widened. It span and quickly fled with a combination of running and slithering like it was walking on living skis, disappearing over a ridge. Percy raised his eyebrows. He didn't think he was that intimidating. However, it quickly became apparent that it was not him that the Dracena had fled from. Percy realized with a sinking feeling, as the large rock he was crouched behind started to twitch. It began to move. A long, thick leg unfurled as long as a car, then 7 more. Oh, you have to be kidding me, Percy thought. He scrambled backwards as a waking arachne unfolded, a snarling, monstrous blob with spindly barbed legs and glinting eyes. He hadn't seen her the first time, the monster having already fell into Tartarus, and he felt like shuddering as he saw her. Arachne had the body of a giant black widow, with a hairy red hourglass mark on the underside of her abdomen and a pair of oozing spinnerets. Her 8 spindly legs were lined with curved barbs as long as Percy's forearm. The most horrible part was her misshapen face. She might once have been a beautiful woman, now black pincers protruded from her mouth like tusks. Her other teeth had grown into thin white needles, fine dark whiskers dotted her cheeks. Her eyes were large, lidless, and pure black with 2 smaller eyes sticking out of her temples. Annabeth had fought this alone. Gods, he loved her strength. Annabeth had fought this alone. She had been trapped with her greatest fear and been forced to battle her, all while he had been stuck in Dionysus' stupid little Colosseum. Percy growled as anger rose in him. Whether that anger was at the gods himself or Gaia, it was all firmly channeled into his hatred for the giant spider unfurling before him. It was her fault he was in Tartarus. It was her fault he'd been forced to abandon the quest and his friends. And worse of all, it was her fault Annabeth had been hurt. Eyes narrowing, Percy gripped his sword tightly and darted forwards at the same time she registered him, pincers clicking and beady black eyes zeroing in on him. But he moved quicker than he thought possible, ducking under her quivering abdomen. Raising his sword high, he plunged his weapon into the thick skin. She screeched in pain. Wag! She burst into an eruption of gold dust, some of it falling into his hair and some of it swirling away over his head to go respawn somewhere else. Percy furrowed his brow angrily. Her death shout had attracted the reluctant Dracena back, its head popping into view over the top of the ridge. It seemed to grin menacingly as it saw the giant spider gone from sight, red eyes glowing like the mist that seemed to cover the entire cavern. It slithered towards him with raised claws, probably thinking he was an easy kill. A demigod in Tartarus, it crowed, laughing throatily at him. You're making it too easy. But Percy was still full of the revenge-type fury, kicking the dust on the rocks, his expression grim and dissatisfied. Arachne had died too slowly. What, she ruined his life and hurt people he loved, and she just got to go poof and reform quick as a flash, as if it hadn't even happened? No, that wasn't fair. She deserved worse. She deserved to feel what he felt. He swung at the monster and it ducked and lunged for his chest, ripping a small hole in his t-shirt. Percy parried the next blow, returning with an instinctual jab sequence that he knew well, even if the sword threw his rhythm off slightly. He caught it on the arm and it roared in pain, hunching over. You little... Whatever it was about to say was cut off in another poof of dust. Percy kicked at the dust moodily, sending up a small puff, still too quick. In fact, as he thought about it, every monster seemed to die too quickly. He was feeling vengeful, he needed a good fight, and he couldn't get that if they couldn't fight through a little stab wound. And they barely even bled if they did at all. There wasn't anything Percy didn't want to use the word satisfying, but it fit how he felt. He needed to get his anger out. There was something in the atmosphere of Tartarus that seemed to heighten every negative emotion he felt. There was a growl to the side, and Percy turned his head, lifting his sword. Out of the darkness he saw more glowing eyes blink open, more fangs glinting in between the stones. A large group of monsters, more Scythian Dracena, probably attracted by screams, faded in from out of nowhere, slithering towards him in a stampede of claws and fangs. Percy tried to not let them surround him, but they closed in too quickly, shutting off escape like a theatrical curtain drop. Percy hacked and slashed at the closest ones, but these monsters were quick and worked well together, quite obviously outnumbering him. Their movements were sporadic and unnatural. Percy was a skilled fighter, but the air was getting to him again, like swallowing a handful of tiny cheese graters, and there were simply too many. Whenever he killed one, another would just ripple out from the shadows and replace it. It seemed as if he had wandered into Dracini Central, found their little setup that they lived in. "Where's your little blonde princess hero?" one snarled sadistically in his ear as he dodged a potentially lethal swipe across the throat by a millimeter. A wave of rage cracked against a wall like glass in Percy's mind, and he slashed into the monster that had set it, with a level of vindictive spite that alarmed even him. But down here he couldn't seem to shake it off like he could on the surface, and he felt that feeling grow with every slash. There was no one down here to calm him down or to back him up, and Percy hated feeling so weak and exposed. Where did they get off saying that to him? It wasn't his fault he was down here, wasn't his fault that he'd left Annabeth for what seemed like the 10th time in a row. It was Gaia's. This was all Gaia's fault. Percy lunged again and again, stabbing and hacking. He could feel his blood beating loudly in his ears. He had something dripping on him, and he shook his arm, trying to get it off. Was there a river nearby? A river above? Some twisted Tartarus version of rain? Percy didn't know, and he didn't care. Whatever it was, he could use it. So as Percy slashed and dodged, he searched for the feeling of nearby water with an outstretched hand, his arm twinging in pain, and pulled onto it as hard as he could. It felt weird, like a thick and warm water almost pulsating, some kind of live milkshake, but Percy kept pulling. If he didn't kill these monsters, no one else would. It was strangely difficult to summon it, like pulling a branch off a tree, but he just assumed that the water in Tartarus just felt different. As if he could hear the branch snapping off the tree, he felt the feeling give way. He clenched his fist. And suddenly, in the middle of the attack, the nearest Dracini dropped like puppets with their strings cut, writhing on the floor. A fog of nausea rolled through Percy like a tank. Well, what was that? The rest took a step back in shock. His hand was shaking in the air. Was that him? What water had he used? Percy couldn't see anything in the air, couldn't see any rivers or rain at his disposal. He looked closer at the howling monsters. There was a dark liquid dribbling out of their ears. Percy almost dismissed the notion entirely. Did he have a hold on their blood? Percy vaguely knew what blood felt like, but he had thought that the water in Tartarus just felt different. But he wasn't holding onto the water, he realized slowly. It was their blood. He snatched his hand back towards him from where it was stretched out, and tucked it close to his chest in horror. That he shouldn't, that wasn't. He felt weird, his whole body tingled with power, but the anger was subsiding under his shock. The cracked glass inside him was beginning to smooth back to normal. The traumatized monsters scrambled to their feet, and with blatant fear smeared across their faces, they ran off into the darkness. The rest stood around, looking unsure what to do. They had given him a wide berth, stood in a circle like Percy was a bomb. He tried to think about what to do, but he had been rendered speechless and thoughtless. He couldn't have just done that, right? That wasn't possible. But he didn't have time to come to terms with his actions, as the pause in action was solved quickly, one of them making a move towards a tired Percy again. They inched forwards, gaining more confidence with each step, and the rest seemed to take it as an example, closing in on him at the same time. Percy raised his sword weakly, ready to fight pedal to the metal, but as it turned out, he didn't need to do anything. A deep war cry bellowed from somewhere above, echoing across the plains of Tartarus, and a titan dropped onto the battlefield. Percy thought he was hallucinating in his addled state. It just wasn't possible that a huge, silvery figure could fall out of the sky and stomp the Dracini flat, trampling them into a big mound of monster dust. But that was exactly what happened. Percy shielded his face, staggering backwards before peeking at the being quickly. He almost fell over in shock. The Titan was 10 feet tall with wild silver Einstein hair, pure silver eyes and muscular arms protruding from a ripped-up blue janitor's uniform. In his hand was a massive push broom. His name tag, incredibly, read Bob. It was Olympus, a Titan that Percy had met before. He was released from Tartarus by Ethan Nakamura during the last Titan War. He had battled Percy, Nico and Thalia and was almost winning, but Percy had grabbed Olympus and pulled the both of them in the river Lethe. When Olympus came out mind blank as a slate, Percy convinced him that his name was Bob and that they were good friends. Percy's memory was fine as being the son of Poseidon and everything. He had manipulated the water so he didn't actually touch the river. Bob turned out to be quite a decent guy after forgetting himself, and Percy was pretty sure he had been given a job in the underworld, this time for the good of the Olympians. He'd meant to check in, but Hera had other plans, and now here he was. Bob, Percy ventured uncertainly. The guy had just saved his life, right? He couldn't have remembered what Percy had done to him, or he wouldn't have helped. The 10-foot Titan turned around, his silvery hair and eyes shining with the red glow of Tartarus. In his hand, he clutched a broom with a sharp spear head on top. He would have looked very intimidating if he hadn't been smiling widely. "Percy," the Titan exclaimed excitedly, "you came back." Percy couldn't speak. He couldn't bring himself to believe that something good had actually happened. "How," he stammered. "Percy called me," the janitor said happily. "Yes, he did." "Oh yeah," Percy managed. "Thanks for the help, it's really good to see you again, Bob." "Yes," the janitor agreed. "Bob, that's me, Bob, Bob, Bob." He shuffled around, obviously pleased with his name. "I am helping, I heard my name. Upstairs in Hades' palace nobody calls for Bob unless there is a mess. Bob, sweep up these bones. Bob, mop up these tortured souls. Bob, a zombie exploded in the dining room." Percy had no idea what to say. "Then I heard my friend call," the Titan beamed. "Percy," said Bob. Percy nodded slowly. He was quite definitely Bob. He didn't seem to remember his Olympus side. That was good, Percy told himself. He could work with that. "That's awesome," he said, seriously, but he tried to sound casual and friendly, which wasn't easy with a throat scorched by firewater. "How did you get to Tartarus?" "I jumped," he said like it was obvious. "You jumped into Tartarus," Percy repeated in disbelief, "because I said your name." "You needed me?" Those silver eyes gleamed in the darkness. "It is okay, I was tired of sweeping the palace." "Why were you even there in the first place?" Percy asked, more to himself. Surely Hades hadn't seriously made a Titan into a janitor. But Bob's smile faded as he answered him. He got a vacant look in his eyes. "Can't remember." "That's okay," Percy said quickly. He decided to ask Bob for directions to change the subject, as he probably knew the area well. "Hey Bob, do you know the way to the doors of death?" Percy asked cautiously. The Titan bounced his head up and down. "It's pretty far from here," he said. Percy's heart sank. Damn, he'd hoped it would be close. Controlling the blood had tired him more than he thought. He still didn't know how to think about that. He was torn. On one hand, they were just monsters and he didn't even mean to. He had thought it was water. But on the other, it seemed wrong. Percy wasn't sure. Normally, he would have asked Annabeth for her opinion, but he wasn't sure what she'd say. Percy decided to remain carefully neutral on it. "Is there any chance you could take me there?" Percy questioned him, and Bob looked unsure for a couple seconds, so Percy changed tacks. "We're friends, right, Bob?" he tried. "We are friends," the Titan agreed, nodding. "That's what friends do, they help each other, right?" Bob looked unsure. "I'd help you if you needed me, Bob," Percy said. "Would you help me?" The Titan nodded again, this time with a determined look, and Percy tried not to back away at the similarity between him and all the other Titans. Yes, I will take you to the doors." "That's great," Percy said, covering his weary expression should the Titan take it the wrong way. He knew that those silver eyes, though sparkling and lively, could turn piercing at any second. Tartarus regenerated monsters. Could that bring Bob's memory back? He just wanted to sleep. He was bruised and his arm still felt funny, the skin getting darker and darker every second. "But we need to have a detour," Percy said suddenly as an idea struck him like a bolt of lightning. "There's something I've gotta do first." He told Bob where they needed to go, and the Titan, though a little reluctant, eventually beamed at him and set off, Percy following loosely behind him. It was a ridiculous idea, and could quite easily kill him, but he knew it would help not just down here but with the whole prophecy. Plus he knew what to do this time. He still had his mother's blessing too. He knew where his mortal point would be, who would tether him to reality. Percy let himself sink into thought. Though Bob could revert back to Olympus at any point, Percy couldn't help but be relieved that he was no longer alone, no longer had to look over his own shoulder constantly. Now he could let himself think, try to plan without being on guard, and just let Bob guide him without having to pay attention. He would know when they were there. It was made of water after all. Percy was going to find the river Styx again, return the Achilles curse. Then he would find the doors of death and get back to Annabeth. Nothing was going to stop him. Nothing. Chapter 4. Annabeth I. Annabeth groaned and let her head fall into her arms. They had about 5 more days until they got back to camp. She had been sat at her desk for a solid 2 of those days, searching her laptop for anything on Tartarus. She thought that she had lost her backpack and dagger when the floor had collapsed when she was fighting Arachne, but apparently Jason had seen it hooked on a web and picked it up before it could fall. This was good, as only Daedalus' laptop could keep up with her fingers flying about the keyboard in search of answers. She'd researched myths, facts, eyewitness accounts that she could tell were fake but read anyway, until her back creaked with a locked strain that only ADHD hyperfixation could give her. There had to be a way to help Percy. A knock on her door had her blinking blearily at the outline of Piper as she came into the room. Her eyes burned at the sudden revelation that her lights were on. It must be night time. Piper walked over to where she was sat, worry on her angular face, and she placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hey Annabeth, you know it's getting pretty late, you need to eat," Piper said firmly yet softly. "No," Annabeth shook her head insistently, gesturing to the piles and piles of paper strewn across her table. "Not yet, not until I find at least one thing we can use from all this." Piper's face creased with concern. "Have you been sleeping?" she asked. "You have bags under your eyes." Annabeth resisted the urge to roll her eyes, partly because she knew that if her eyes rolled upwards she might pass out. "I've been sleeping when I need to," she said. It was half a lie and half a truth. "Let me guess," said Piper, too intuitive for her own good, "you haven't needed to." Annabeth didn't answer. "I know you want to help him, but," Piper started, and Annabeth knew exactly what she would say next. "Percy wouldn't want you to do this to yourself." Annabeth looked at her friend. She knew she cared, and deep down below her desperation she really appreciated it. She needed a friend like Piper more than she had realized, but just not right now. "Piper," she said, adding the plea in her voice, "if you're not going to help, then just please leave me alone." She half expected Piper to walk out at that, not come back, maybe get angry at her or snap at her. But she didn't. The daughter of Aphrodite took Annabeth's hand gently, cold from all the typing on her keyboard, and tugged her out of her seat. Her back was so scrunched and kinked, she couldn't help but sigh out loud as everything aligned back into place. "No, Annabeth," Piper told her, looking immensely regretful, "you need to eat and then sleep, remember." Annabeth dimly heard a faint melody caressing her eardrums. It whispered Piper's words to her softly, and though Annabeth felt a loud thought trying to burrow into her conscience, a reminder of something, a warning perhaps, she ignored it instead. She found herself obediently nodding. It really hit her how much she needed to eat and then sleep all of a sudden. Why hadn't she done those things before? Quite silly of her not to. Eating and sleeping were essential. She saw walls moving, felt footsteps under her walking boots. Eyes turning in her direction. Quiet and then low voices, one a little more defensive than the others. A chair pushed under her, and then eventually a feeling of warmth in her stomach. It was only a few minutes later that Annabeth became more aware of what she was doing, where she was. She blinked and the image of the dining room wafted into view. She was sat at the table in the dining room at the head of the table. To her left sat Leo, Jason and Piper, to her right Frank, Hazel and Coach Hedge. They were all tucking into their Chinese food. Her eyes flicked to the windows opposite. It was dark outside, darker than she'd ever seen the night sky, not a star in sight, and the sea shook their boat every now and then, wild torrents of black waves hitting the wooden sides. Her attention refocused to the sudden coldness of the metal cutlery in her hands sinking into her skin, murmurs sharpening into actual words around her. The taste of soy sauce rested in her mouth. She blinked again. "You used charm speak on me," she demanded to a suddenly guilty-looking Piper across the table, slamming her cutlery down with a loud bang. All conversation fell silent and they shifted nervously. She saw them glance at each other, exchanging looks of panic, and not one of them directly looked her in the eye. "Annabeth, we're really sorry, but you needed," Jason started. "So you decided to charm speak me like you would some common monster," she snapped. "You weren't eating," Piper rose to the defense, looking indignant. "I was. Those little half-melted cereal bars don't count. They do. You needed to come down and eat a hot meal. And I would have. Annabeth found herself raising her voice louder than she had in days, when I'd found something useful that we could do something with, but until that time I was going to work. It's been 2 days since we last saw you. We were worried, Hazel reasoned, and as much as she tried, Annabeth couldn't calm down. What, that I couldn't take care of myself? She asked them. That's not what. That I'm that helpless without him that I don't have enough common sense to function. She could tell that it didn't go unnoticed that she skipped his name, and she saw Frank and Jason exchange a glance across the table. A deep scowl fell onto her face and she watched Leo go pale. We just wanted you to come sit down, and Piper didn't get far before Annabeth cut her off again, unwilling to listen, and though she knew deep down she meant no harm, slightly wary of the charm speaker. Just stop it, she snapped. I don't have time to sit down and play happy families. He's in Tartarus. Tartarus, do you get that? You know, I may not have found a way for him to get out, but I did discover one thing. Did you know that time passes differently down there? One day up here could be a week, a month, a year. She noticed Hazel and Nico look guiltily at each other. Did you know this? She rounded on them angrily. Yes, Nico said flatly. I've been there, remember. Annabeth cooled off a bit at that. She dropped her eyes and sank back into her chair. She just wanted to help, but nothing was telling her anything. It wasn't even that the sources were wrong, it was that the sources in general were far and few between. But Nico had been there, and though she knew it was a delicate subject, she couldn't help but give in to the urge to ask him. She knew it had been bad for a son of Hades, but shadows and monsters were part of his domain. Percy's natural strengths were in the sea and the rain, neither of which she guessed were down there. She leant forwards almost unconsciously. Nico knew, and she had to as well. She needed to know everything she could to help Percy. She tried to phrase it tactfully, but thought it would be better to say it outright than hop around the question and insult his intelligence. What was it like for a demigod? She asked. Nico hesitated, and as much as they obviously tried not to, everyone looked at him. His eyes flashed as he crossed his skinny arms. It was bad, Annabeth, Nico said simply. You know it is, it's literally hell. I was in there for a few days, I think, on the surface at least. Annabeth knew she shouldn't, knew that it was still fresh and vivid in his mind, but she pressed on. Yes, but what was it like? Nico scowled harder. Hot, dark, endless. He paused between each word, and though the young teenager visibly tried to control himself, he couldn't seem to stop his skin getting whiter with every description he tossed out. Ignoring the mimed warnings being thrown her way, Annabeth kept on digging at her first credible source, and maybe she hadn't quite forgiven Nico yet for hiding Percy at Camp Jupiter from her. As a son of Hades, how do you think a son of Poseidon would fare? Nico didn't answer, he seemed to not want to. Like I said, I barely survived, he said eventually, avoiding the question, and his voice grew smaller as he spoke, as if he was falling back into the void of the underworld. Gaia's forces overwhelmed me instantly. They're so powerful down there, I almost went insane. He looked up at Annabeth, and she felt such a strong wave of empathy from the boy she almost didn't recognize him. But to her, the look in his eyes, it looked like pity. Like she was a grieving widow and he was patting her on the back at Percy's funeral. Annabeth hated pity. What does it look like down there? She asked, a whole stream of questions entering her mind. Would there be any way to navigate it, any way to send a message or to receive a message? Annabeth Frank interjected worriedly. Way at all to help him, to send down supplies at least. I don't. Nico was getting annoyed, but that just set off Annabeth in turn, who was sick of him skirting over what she was asking. Just give me a straight answer, she demanded. Annabeth, I don't know, Nico snapped loudly, shooting up to stand in his seat. I wasn't exactly down there sketching the architecture. It was just monster after monster after monster with no end in sight until those giants kidnapped me. I don't know what can be done to help Percy, probably because there's nothing that can be done. With that he pushed away his chair, which fell on its back with a loud bang, and strode out the door. The shadows in the room flickered, and for a second Annabeth thought she saw ghostly faces in them. Hazel slipped out after him, sending Annabeth a disapproving frown. There was an awkward silence lingering after, and Annabeth sat down. She hadn't even realized she'd stood up. All the indignation had gone out of her, draining into a tired kind of guilt. These were her friends, she shouldn't fight them. They were just as unhappy as she was, and each of them had cried their fair share in the first few days. She had heard Jason and Frank blame themselves harshly, saying that they both should have flown down to go catch him, even though Nico had assured them that they would have been sucked down too, which would have been even worse. "It just feels like no one else wants to help," Annabeth mumbled. "Of course we do, Annabeth," Jason told her gently. "We miss him too. I don't want him to come back like." The words hung in the air, and she could tell they all heard what she hadn't said, the unspoken end to her sentence. She didn't want Percy to come back like Nico, all ghostly white and weak and frail and the opposite of who he was. She didn't want him to forget about her either. If 5 days could be 5 years, would he even still remember her face? Remember their plans? Would he come out shredded and sickly in his early 20s, more monster than mortal? "Guys, this is Percy," Leo said. "He'll be fine, dude can do anything." "There are rivers in Tartarus," Annabeth murmured. They weren't nice rivers though. Amnesia, depression, pain, more pain, and certain death. She hoped he could control them. "That could be good, Annabeth, but there isn't really anything we can do until we have the gods back," Piper placated, still on the subject, unaware of Annabeth's thoughts racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. "I know that," Annabeth said shortly, but winced after. "God, sorry, But she was cut off by a loud crash that echoed from the deck above them. Their heads snapped up and weapons were drawn instantly as the boat shook, and the heavy pattering of footsteps swarmed the floorboards above them. Annabeth gripped Riptide tightly in its pen form in her pocket. She had kept it with her since Percy had left it behind. It was vaguely comforting, like a bit of him was still there with her. "Monsters," Frank frowned. They all got out of their chairs, taking out their weapons. At the risk of setting the ship on fire again, Leo seemed to have foregone his usual flaming hands and gripped a solid-looking hammer in his hand. Taking the lead, Jason gestured for them to wait. "Let me check first," he said firmly before taking a breath and ducking around the corner. They waited a beat, but Annabeth wasn't having it. She pushed past, and the others followed her as she rushed out onto the deck. Sky was black outside, the noise of the tempestuous sea roaring in her ears. The only light in the battle came from some solar power lights Leo had strung around the mast, though she could see him hurrying to set ablaze a torch in the corner. Hazel and Nico were already fighting, blurs of black and gold, and a slightly overwhelmed Jason was methodically cutting down a small group trying to bite him. His gladius was wrapped in electricity like barbed wire, flashing light illuminating the snarling monsters. There was quite an assortment, a couple harpies, some impausa, and a hellhound. That was quickly dealt with by Nico though, who sent it back to his father with a snap of his fingers. To her left, Annabeth vaguely saw a large sea monster vanish into the water, one that had seemingly brought the crew of monsters to attack their ship. Desperate for any action to take her mind off of Percy, she jumped straight into the fight. "Fight me, you ugly-looking skunk!" Coach Hedge yelled behind her as he waved his bat around his head before clocking a harpy across the jaw. Piper ran through a harpy in a satisfying burst of gold as Annabeth drew the last impausa into a fight. "Think you're missing someone, aren't you?" mocked the monster, and there was something in its voice that Annabeth briefly recognized, though she couldn't see it too well in the black of the night. The remaining monsters howled in laughter. "Shut up," Annabeth shouted, lunging at the head. "Annabeth, behind you!" Frank shouted, and the next thing the monster, who had been sneaking up behind her, knew, an eagle dragged it over the side of the ship. The impausa blocked her jab, but Annabeth was already following it up with a skilled disarm, aiming a kick towards the non-goat leg, some kind of wooden peg leg which her mind dimly realized was strange, as most impausa usually had celestial bronze legs. "You don't get to speak about him," she spat. "What, you think we don't know where your boyfriend is?" the impausa cackled. "Every monster knows where he is, and believe me, we've all totally got more than enough grudges against him." Annabeth saw a couple heads turn at the words, her friends' expressions alarmed. "You know he's all on his own down there," the impausa giggled. "I know," Annabeth gritted out, swinging violently. "He's going to die down there," it hissed. "No, he's not," Annabeth shouted and jumped the monster, slamming it strongly down to the ground. The move caught it by surprise as Annabeth kicked its weapon across the deck. It seemed to forget to fight, and whether it was distracted or just in shock that a daughter of Athena would do such a reckless thing, it made no difference when Annabeth held her dagger against its throat. "Tell me where he is," she shouted, as Leo killed the last one to the right of her, swinging his hammer like a bat. The others crowded round the pinned Impausi, whose torn clothing seemed familiar, and Annabeth felt wary eyes on her, but she ignored them. "He's in Tartarus, duh," the vampiric monster laughed beneath her. "I know that," Annabeth hissed, digging the tip of her dagger into the paper-white skin. "Where is he down there? Is he okay? Is he close to the doors?" The Impausi snorted. "He won't make it to the doors." "Why?" Annabeth said, digging her knee into where she knew a sensitive point was in Impausi in the torso above the donkey leg. It gasped and began to splutter. "Isn't it obvious? Athena spawn, he's a demigod in Tartarus. Monsters can totally smell him from hundreds of miles away, can smell the blood on his clothes and the stench of the sea on his skin. Add that to the fact that he's pretty much unarmed and well, you'll never see your precious boyfriend again." "Pretty much unarmed," Annabeth tried to tune out the rest and focus on the odd phrase. "Does that mean he is sort of armed?" "He left his magic sword up here, didn't he?" The Impausi smiled sickly. "Can't fight with his bare hands forever." It nodded towards the pen sticking out of Annabeth's pocket. "That's it, isn't it, Jackson's sword?" Annabeth readjusted her grip. A wave hit the side of the boat and sent a spray of water droplets over the group. She tried to stop fantasizing about stabbing the arrogant vampire. "That's not what I asked," she said. "Does he or does he not have a weapon?" "Don't you recognize me?" it replied instead, voice losing all playfulness and dropping into a spiteful tone. Annabeth knew it was stalling for time but blinked a bit to clear her tunnel vision. Leo held the now-lit torch over her head and their little part of the deck flooded with orange-tinted color. She only had to glance at the uniform to realize who she had pinned. She remembered Kelly. 2 years ago at Percy's freshman orientation, he and their friend Rachel Dare had been attacked by Impausi disguised as cheerleaders. One of them had been Kelly. Later, the same Impausi had attacked them in Daedalus' workshop. Annabeth had stabbed her in the back. She gritted her teeth. She had faced a lot of bad monsters over the years, but she hated Impausi more than most. Men were especially susceptible to their powers. Kelly had almost killed Percy. She had manipulated Annabeth's oldest friend, Luke, urging him to commit darker and darker deeds in the name of Kronos. The Impausi's favorite tactic was to make a guy fall in love with her, then drink his blood and devour his flesh. Not a great first date. "Kelly," she said icily. "You know her?" asked Nico. She nodded. "I can't say it's a pleasure. Now answer me, does Percy have a weapon?" "Well, you know what? I think my memory is improving. Weapon, all I can say is that he didn't when we attacked him," Kelly cackled. "What, you've seen him?" Annabeth shouted, eyes wide. "How is he?" asked Frank. "Is he okay?" Hazel rushed to ask. "Put it this way, he won't be down there for long," Kelly giggled before squeaking as Annabeth dug her knee in again. "Broken arm, coughing up blood, and I know I totally bit him on the arm," she trailed off teasingly. "Wait," Annabeth said, a few things clicking in her head. "You attacked him, but now you're here. You say you didn't kill him. He killed you, didn't he?" She smiled for the first time in a few days. "He killed you without a weapon." "He had a weapon?" she snapped, all mocking gone, replaced by angry indignation. "He punched me in the face and then the little brat stole my metal leg, killed my friends with it, and then me. Mother Earth brought me back quickly to kill all of you, but look at what I got for it." She waved her wooden leg around as best she could under Annabeth. "A wooden leg? That's so not trendy. He killed me with my own leg. I can't even." "He's armed," Leo said. "He can fight." "If you see him again, tell him I love him," Annabeth said coolly, before plunging her knife into Kelly's chest and getting up. "Now we have information. Now we can have dinner," she said, significantly more relaxed and yet more worried. She had just sent her back to Tartarus, back to Percy. What if she actually attacked him again? Annabeth took a breath and just told herself the facts again. "He's injured but not enough to fight. That's good, that's good." "That's great," Hazel said soothingly. "This is Percy. He can fight his way through anything." "At least we know now that he survived the fall," Jason said. "I would have known if he had died," Nico reluctantly spoke up. Annabeth's head snapped up. Her legs wobbled a bit from exhaustion. "Nico, I need updates every day whenever you feel any difference," she told him quickly. Nico nodded. "It's how I knew he had survived the fall." "That's good," she said again. "That's good." Leo raised an eyebrow at her. "What?" she snapped, the adrenaline of the fight and of finding out more about Percy leaving her a little on edge. They stared at her and she swallowed. Look, I'm sorry, I. They looked at her with such understanding that a lump formed in her throat and she couldn't take it anymore. She turned and walked quickly off, her nose stinging as she held back the urge to cry. Gods, her emotions were a wreck nowadays. She heard a quiet buzz of conversation behind her before footsteps echoed, catching her up. I don't want to talk right now, she said succinctly. In fact, I need to Iris message Sally. I think she should know where her only son is. She sniffed loudly at the end, not making eye contact. That's fine, I'll come with you, Frank offered. No, I don't need a chaperone, Annabeth snapped, but it was in a wobbling voice, turning the corner towards the bedrooms. I'm not a chaperone, gods no, I'm just a friend, here to help you break bad news about someone I care about as well. Fine, Annabeth said bluntly, too drained to argue anymore. She walked straight into Percy's room. Frank didn't say anything, not even a meaningless platitude about how everything was going to be all right, which she was grateful for. A quick route around found a spare drachma under his bed. The duvet still smelt of him. She threw the coin into the mist created by the small bottle on his bedside drawer. She wished she could iMessage Percy, but the call refused to connect. Iris had no presence down there. Oh Iris, goddess of the rainbow, show me Sally Jackson, Upper East Side, Manhattan. The air shimmered a delicate silver, waves of rainbows drifting across as if trying to get signal. Annabeth watched it connect tersely, unsure of whether she actually wanted it to go through. Sally had been through enough already. But too soon the image of the Jackson Blofies' apartment swam lazily into view, and Annabeth felt like sobbing. That apartment was like a second home to her. She looked at parts of the living room and her mind was flooded with memories. She looked at the dining table and instantly saw herself having Chinese takeout with Percy and his parents. She saw the television and looked on sadly as she and Sally watched a documentary together, chatting away like the mother and daughter they each never had. Her eyes drifted to the sofa and she could suddenly feel the warmth of Percy next to her as they fell asleep, his strong arms around her waist making her feel safer than she'd ever felt before. The apartment door opened and Paul and Sally walked in, shopping bags in hand. Sally stopped dead when she saw Annabeth, who offered a weak but wobbly smile. Their eyes met. The shopping bags crashed to the floor. Annabeth, Sally sprinted over to her, Paul not far behind. Have you found him? He left me a voicemail a little while ago, Sally spoke urgently, and Annabeth winced at the hoarseness of her voice. He was in Alaska, he said something about a quest. Please tell me you found him. A lump formed in Annabeth's throat. Percy's mother clearly wasn't sleeping, judging by the dark shadows and red rims around her eyes. She hadn't seen her son in over 8 months. Paul looked worn out next to her, and he too looked at Annabeth as if she held their lives in her hands. We did find him, Annabeth started. Oh, thank the gods! Sally seemed to visibly deflate, and she leant into Paul, who wrapped an arm around her shoulder. How is he? Where is he? Frank wasn't in view of Percy's parents, but Annabeth saw him send a sympathetic and wincing look in their direction. I just want to start by saying that he's alive, Annabeth said, knowing that that was probably the most important thing to tell them. Sally's eyes snapped up, watery and worried. Annabeth felt her own prickle with tears. Hera, she said. Hera took his memories. Paul gasped. He doesn't remember us. Annabeth shook her head quickly. He got them back, but she kept him in a sort of coma for 6 months. Then she woke him up and took him to Lupa, a Roman wolf goddess who trained him for 2 more months. He went to camp like Camp Half-Blood, but for Roman demigods. But then there was another prophecy, another great prophecy about the world ending, and we're still in it, trying to stop Gaia, but he. She paused. The 2 mortals had been listening to her story with rapt attention, their faces getting more horrified by the second. Frank gave her an encouraging nod, though he too seemed affected by her words. I had to do something to get the gods back, she told them. They're gone right now, so I had to go on this quest. I was in this lair, and Percy and the others got there soon, but the floor collapsed and I was going to fall in too, but he saved me. She sobbed into her hands, but he fell instead. He fell. Fell where? Sally had tears streaming down her cheeks in sheer desperation, her hands splayed over her slightly more prominent than usual stomach, Paul next to her looking blank with shock. Into an inn. Into Tartarus, Frank said gently, suddenly next to her as her shoulders shook. Annabeth didn't look up from her palms and no one spoke. The silence was full of shock. She sniffed hard, trying to rein herself in. It was harder than she thought it would be, and even Frank's hand on her back was shaking. She looked up. "We'll get him back," she told a stunned Sally fiercely. "We know he's alive, and we know that he's armed. I swear to you, we'll get him back. I swear on the river Styx that I'll find him even if it kills me." "Tartarus," Sally whispered with wide blue eyes, and Annabeth could tell that every myth she'd ever heard and every monster she'd ever seen was flying through her head. Her bottom lip wobbled, and for a second Annabeth thought she would turn on her and blame her, curse her for damning her son to hell. Her hands started to shake, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Sally's face just split into a sob, and she began to cry into her hands. Paul quickly pulled her into a tight hug. Oh gods, what are we going to do? My little boy's in Tartarus, Paul, my little boy, oh gods," she cried into her husband's shoulder, her body racked with sobs. "We'll find him," Annabeth whispered, her throat thick with emotion. "I'll find him." Frank sniffed next to her, hugging his arms around himself. It was horrible to watch Sally cry, to see the despair in Paul's eyes. Annabeth had to look away. She didn't notice when the message fizzled out, too busy staring at Percy's blue hoodie on his chair with faraway eyes. Frank held out a hand, and though she didn't need to, she took it. He needed comfort after that whole disaster too. Standing up quickly, she brushed away tears from her blotchy face. "You need to sleep," Frank said gently. "We need you awake and assertive so you can tell us all off tomorrow." "I'm sorry for yelling earlier," she sniffled. That's fine," Frank said, now a little awkwardly, clearly unsure what to do. "Which one's your room again?" Annabeth hesitated. "Here," she decided eventually. She curled up on Percy's bed, letting her exhausted and dehydrated head fall onto his pillow. Frank shifted from foot to foot. "Okay," he said, "but you're dealing with Coach Hedge. Break his rules and he just goes crazy. You know, he threw a baseball at me last time Frank's voice drifted off as Annabeth slowly passed out, the smell of sea salt and cold air in her nose. Chapter 5. Percy I. There were some right ugly suckers in Tartarus, thought Percy, stepping over a sleeping hellhound as carefully as he could. He was deep in stealth mode. It was still a long way until the river Styx. Bob had told him that the river Phlegethon, not Phlegm as it turned out, flowed throughout the whole pit, especially close to the doors, which made it so much harder to keep going in the direction they were going, namely away from said river. In fact, Percy hadn't seen it in what felt like weeks. The Styx was far away in practically the opposite direction. Once he got there, he'd have to double back, assuming he would have any sense of direction in the black and endless void that surrounded him. At least Bob knew a shortcut to Styx. But what he had failed to mention, however, was where this shortcut went through. Hand on his sword, Percy stepped over another snoozing hellhound. They were unnaturally huge, lying around in the small chasm he walked through, their snores like the rumbling of thunder. The fact that their fur was pitch black did not help, as the light was even more limited where he was. The dim glow of his sword would illuminate a claw or a fang here and there, just enough light for him to clench his teeth and veer his foot out of the way. The smell of blood and dirt lay in Percy's nose. Every now and then one would snort in its sleep, and Percy would freeze, ready to strike at the first sign of those glowing red eyes. Percy sucked in a low breath as a tail the size of a boa constrictor sleepily flicked in his direction. He felt a pang of loss for Mrs. O'Leary. She'd deal with them far better than he could, so would Bob. Bob's size had prevented him from walking down the narrow ravine of jutting rocks, so he had to take a different way, and with his enormous strides would probably beat Percy to their rendezvous point. Wherever that was, Percy had been too busy killing a manticore trying to rip up his face to listen to what Bob had mumbled to himself. He was sure that he'd turn up at some point. He prayed he would. Percy needed him in order to get to Styx. He wasn't sure what would happen after. This was all about getting back to Annabeth, and Percy wasn't here to make friends. He felt like being alone while dangerous was slightly better. He'd learned to watch his own back, and having a Titan watching it instead didn't exactly make him feel secure. Sure, Bob was nice, but Percy couldn't forget how hard Apetus had tried to kill him and his friends. Bob was his friend, for now. Not picking his feet up the whole way worked well to not cause any loud stomping noises to give him away. But as Percy winced, it didn't help when there were loose rocks lying around, practically invisible in the black air. He watched in horror as his foot booted a small stone a few feet, unable to stop it. The stone hit the ground twice, 3 times before settling, the clattering noise hammering into his head with each bounce. Arrararars. Out the corner of his wide eyes, Percy saw a hellhound rise from its previous slump. It shook its shaggy head facing the other way. It hadn't noticed him yet. Others around him were stirring too, the environment coming alive and rippling around him. He had seconds at the most. Scanning desperately, not moving as to not alert the drowsy beasts, Percy quickly mapped out a way to climb up to the top of the ravine in his head. He'd jump onto the low ledge, climb, and then he'd have to pull himself up the rest of the way. He'd follow the cliff edge until the end. The hellhound closest to him sniffed the air audibly, and a giant head started tilting around in his direction. Sweat running down his back, Percy slid his sword into his trouser loop slowly. It cracked against his plastic bottle noisily. Percy was already sprinting as blood-red eyes snapped open. Practically throwing himself at the steep cliffside, his arms struggled to keep pace with his pushing feet, kicking off the stones to climb higher, faster, the hellhounds barreling towards him with baying howls. Percy found a ledge and hoisted himself into the air just as they slammed into the cliff below him, barking and foaming at the mouth. They were fully awake now, snapping at his ankles with teeth like daggers. Menacing growls echoed down the ravine. They were too close. Percy scrabbled onto the small ledge he had spotted to try and get away. He had to climb up. Tartarus hated him with a passion. The solid-looking ledge under his feet, once solid, crumbled like sand. Percy dropped a foot, scraping his nails to bloody messes as he dug them into the stone in order to stay up. Well, this was familiar. Arg! Percy groaned through gritted teeth as sharp, snapping teeth sank into the back of his heel. His Achilles heel, just to make it ironic. He wrenched his limb out of the ravenous mouth with a howl and pressed his other foot against a small jutting rock, pushing his body up in one jerking movement. A couple more pulls up and he could rest his knees on a safe-looking stone. Now out of teeth range, he glanced down. The hellhounds were gathered at the bottom, jumping up and snarling like crocodiles at the base of a cliff. Percy grimaced at the feeling of blood dribbling out the ring of puncture wounds. It splashed in beads below him, incensing the furious dogs. They leapt up, but the sounds of their long claws scraping down the stones were drowned out by the poolsing in Percy's ears. The blood in his head was whirling around like a storm. He didn't think he had enough energy to pull himself up. His arm, while pretty much healed up, was still shaky at times, the bruises still a dim green. A hacking cough erupted from him, nearly dislodging his grip. The air was getting to him again. It happened less nowadays, but when it caught up with him eventually, it was the same cheese grater down the throat pain he had first felt. A couple drops of blood spattered across the face of rock in front of him. His throat was starting to blister. Praying desperately to Percy didn't even know his father maybe, he let go with one hand. The full pressure stretching his knuckles, Percy knew he didn't have long until the shaking in his arm would shake him loose. He unhooked his bottle and grimaced in anticipation. He didn't have much of the river water left in his bottle. Percy gulped it down and retched, barely having enough time to pour a capful of the water on his ankle. He jerked on impact, his fingertips inadvertently snatching back and letting go. Percy grunted as he slid down the cliff a few meters until he landed, his feet slamming into the floor, followed by his knees. His aching arm went to his waist and withdrew nothing. He glanced down in panic, then up. Where he had been just a second ago, his sword balanced precariously on a rock. Of course it did. The hellhounds seemed to grin as they circled him. Pure bloodthirst dripping from their eyes and teeth. They had him pinned and they knew it. Hellhounds weren't just mindless beasts, they liked the hunt and they reveled in the capture, even more so in the kill. Percy was well and truly captured, them on one side, the rock cliff on the other, but he wasn't dead, not yet. Percy followed them with his eyes as they padded about in front of him, pack animals of pure muscle and force. There it was again, the feeling of a body of water. Only it was literally a body or bodies, the hounds in front of him. He didn't know why he was having such a strong reaction to the feeling of blood. It was like Tartarus wanted him to feel it, like it had amplified his senses, particularly to things he probably shouldn't feel. It felt disgusting. He didn't want to know how squirmy blood felt in the body, but it was hard to ignore. He could feel each hound in the air individually, feel the blood pumping faster around their bodies as they got closer and closer. What looked like the alpha of the pack came forward first, Percy's blood smeared across the black fur around its snout. He locked eyes with it. Unsure if it was the right thing to do, Percy hesitated. He considered his options. Turning around to run for his sword would mean sharp claws sinking into his spine. Staying still would mean his head in the alpha's jaws. He concluded as the alpha looked about to pounce that if he was going to get out of here, he was going to have to. There wasn't going to be another way of escape, not this time. Just as it drew back to spring on him, jaws slavering, Percy grabbed the bead of the blood with an outstretched hand. It was like balancing a water balloon aloft in his hand, feeling the liquid swoosh from side to side, the weight and density of it. It felt delicate, like how he knew that if he squeezed his hand the water balloon will burst. Percy felt like he could burst the feeling in his hand, and though he didn't know what that meant, he knew there was only one way to find out. Instead of a sharp headache this time, a strange coolness settled over him with only a twinge at his temples. He knew that he had to do this. It was him or them. The beast screeched and rolled over as if trying to scratch fleas out from under its skin. Digging its head into the ground, it scratched its own paws into its skull, a dreadful whining roar coming out. The other hellhounds snarled in confusion, some backing up, others getting closer. Percy faltered. Its whine sounded too similar to Mrs. O'Leary's. It felt like he was hurting his own dog. Sensing a moment of weakness, another one reared. Before it had even left the ground, Percy had it writhing, his other hand outstretched now. Yeah, not his dog, he thought hard, like he was trying to stamp it onto his brain. This one wanted to eat him. Down, boy, Percy panted, wetness trickling out of his nostril, and clenching his fists tightly, the monsters exploded into dust. Before the others could attack, he killed them too. It was easier this time. He knew what to do. On the last one, he grabbed the feeling of blood being pumped around the entirety of its body and jerked his hand down. The hellhound collapsed to the floor, pinned by an unseen force. When it whined helplessly, Percy finished it off. It was like it was a puppet and he could somehow hold its strings. It was strange. When he held onto blood, he could feel their entire body's movements. It was like if he clenched hard enough, he could pull parts away from each other. Percy grimaced, rubbing his arms. He suddenly found his human body very fragile. Looking from side to side, Percy could see no more. At least his energy was rejuvenated from the water, but now there was no more. He'd used it all on repairing as much as he could of his ankle, which had now scabbed over. He'd have to move quickly, maybe ask Bob to go get some for him. With years of lava wall training now remembered, Percy scaled the cliff partially to grab his sword before carrying on through the bottom of the ravine. He felt like nothing would bother him for a while. As he walked, he reached up and wiped off the smear of blood under his nose. It was as if his head was fighting what he did, though it was probably about the equivalent of controlling a small pond. Maybe it was because it was so concentrated, Percy didn't know. Eventually, the cliffs widened and flattened. Percy was once again in a flat expanse of nothing, the eerie red mist blanketing further view from any direction. Like a sandstorm suspended in time. Percy had seen enough horror films when he was younger to resist the urge to shout for the amnesiac titan. They'd be on him quicker than Grover on a tin can. Instead, he found a small rock and plunked himself down to wait for Bob, who was taking his time. It wasn't as if he could be attacked at any time or anything. No, bring it on. Actually, Percy thought, his mood a little less bleak after the hellhound defeat. Tartarus was just a glorified training ground. He just needed to hit 100% of the targets. Let the monsters come. He had a new trick up his sleeve. Deciding to wander about in a circle just to see if Bob was lost nearby, maybe, Percy stood up. The ground crunched beneath his feet, disturbing the strange silence that had settled over him and the whole area. In fact, he thought with a frown, he hadn't heard much lately. Tartarus was quiet, but he could always hear something in the background, howls, snarls, screams. Now, a still silence settled over him. He entered some kind of forest that had materialized out of the mist. It didn't seem like it fitted in the cavern-like place. Nature didn't seem to touch this place. There was nothing here that could be regarded as natural, at least. No grass growing through the black stones, no ivy creeping up rocks. Everything was dry and dead. It certainly played along well with the theme of the place, though. Towering black trees soared into the creepy gloom, with bare branches like bony fingers reaching for his face. The wood was mangled and twisted, roots shooting straight down into the ground as if they too were trying to escape the darkness of the pit. Percy's skin began to crawl, and he found himself aware of every little noise or movement, like his hair had been electrocuted and it was sending jolts into his brain. He wasn't sure what had set him off. Eyebrows furrowed and a flat line of a mouth, Percy ceased moving, stopped breathing in. The silence of the surrounding area filled him until it was broken by a twig snapping. Percy's head whipped around. It hit him that he was lost, completely and utterly. Everything looked the same in every direction. Another twig snapped and Percy took out his sword, looking around cautiously. The tree next to him quivered and Percy backed away with a frown. Nothing looked different, but he definitely heard something. But then again, Tartarus did play tricks on the mind. Again. A few yards away, a tree shuddered. Something was moving above him. The only problem was that Percy couldn't see the top of the branches in the black gloominess overhead. He strained his eyes, but nothing moved. He could dismiss it as him being paranoid, but was he? No, he wasn't. For just as he thought that, a monster fell to the ground like a meteor about 10 feet away. It looked strongly like a fury, but Percy knew vividly what they looked like. This one looked off. It was a wrinkled hag with brass talons, bat-like wings, and red eyes that glowed similarly to those of a hellhound. In a tattered black dress, her face twisted, it resembled a demonic grandmother. Another fell behind him, then a few more until around half a dozen were glaring at him like he was a slab of meat. More hissed in the trees above. "Good morning," Percy tried. "Or is it night now?" he asked genuinely. It had been a while since he'd seen sunlight, and he craved the pure, weightless warmth it gave out, as opposed to the thick heat in the air of Tartarus. Silence. Percy tried to locate the speaker, but none of the demons had moved their mouths. Their eyes looked dead, their expressions were frozen. The voice simply floated overhead like a movie narrator's, as if a single mind controlled all the creatures. "All right then," he said, "no offense or anything, but who are you?" "We are Arai, the curses, and we have orders to curse you, of course, to destroy you 1,000 times in the name of all that is law down here." "Only 1,000 times," Percy murmured. "Oh good, I thought I was in trouble. Why are you destroying me?" "We have orders." "From who?" he questioned. Percy was annoyed. If someone was going to kill him, they usually did it face to face. What was he, a minor annoyance? Percy liked to think he was a major annoyance, thank you very much. The demon ladies all took a step forward in tandem, as if one mind controlled them all like puppets. They smiled sickly as if that answered his question. Well, that didn't bode well. Percy took out his sword with that satisfying shink noise, holding it aloft so they could all see he wasn't playing around. He was relieved when they started to close in on him. Sure, he was terrified. He didn't like the odds of 1 against however many there were, but at least he understood fighting, wandering through the darkness waiting to be attacked, that had been driving him crazy. Then he got jumped by a gang of grandmas.